On a quiet July morning in 1863, as the smoke of cannon fire drifted over the hills of Gettysburg, a 19-year-old farm boy from Gettysburg folded a blood-stained letter and slipped it into his coat pocket. He had no idea that by sunset he would be lying beneath the same sky he once plowed under as a child, watching it fade for the last time. But this is not just a story about war. It is a story about a promise, a mother's prayer, a brother's sacrifice, and a letter that would not be opened for 70 years. If you think you know the story of America's Civil War, stay with me, because this one was nearly lost to history. Before the cannons roared, and before history carved its scars into Pennsylvania soil, Thomas Whitaker was just a boy who loved the fields. Thomas was born in 1844 on a modest farm 2 miles outside Gettysburg. The land wasn't rich, but it was honest. His father, Samuel Whitaker, believed that a man's character was shaped by 2 things: hard soil and harder choices. By age 10, Thomas could mend a fence, milk a cow, and read scripture aloud at the dinner table. By 15, he could plow a straight line better than most grown men. But what Thomas loved most was the sky. He used to lie on his back in the tall grass and stare upward, imagining what the future might hold. He once told his younger sister, Eliza, "One day I'll see the whole country, from the Atlantic to wherever it ends." Eliza had laughed. "That's too big for you, Tommy." But America itself was growing bigger and darker. By 1861, whispers of division had turned into gunfire. When news reached town that President Abraham Lincoln had called for volunteers to preserve the Union, the church bells rang not in celebration, but in warning. Thomas was 17. He watched men from town line up in the square, farmers, blacksmiths, teachers. Some were smiling, some were silent. His best friend, Caleb Turner, placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "We'll be heroes," Caleb said. Thomas didn't answer. That night at the dinner table, his father spoke quietly. "This war will change everything." His mother, Margaret, reached for Thomas's hand under the table. She already knew. Thomas enlisted on his 19th birthday. He told his mother it was his duty. He told his sister it would be an adventure. He told his father he would come home. But the truth was simpler and more painful. He didn't want other boys to die in his place. Margaret Whitaker packed him bread, dried apples, and a small leather Bible. Inside the cover, she wrote, "No matter where you go, God goes with you." Thomas folded the Bible into his coat pocket. He would carry it through mud, blood, and memory. 2 years later, war found its way back to Thomas's doorstep. The Union and Confederate armies collided in and around Gettysburg. What had once been quiet farmland turned into the deadliest battlefield in American history. Thomas recognized the hills, the fences, the oak tree near Cemetery Ridge. He had climbed that tree as a boy. Now he crouched beneath it, rifle shaking in his hands. Cannons thundered. Smoke choked the sky. Men screamed for their mothers. Caleb Turner fell before noon. Thomas dragged him behind a stone wall, pressing his hands against a wound that would not close. "Tell my pa I wasn't scared," Caleb whispered. Thomas nodded. But Caleb was scared. They all were, on the morning of July 3rd, before what would later be known as Pickett's Charge. Thomas wrote a letter. Not to his father, not to his sister, to his mother. He wrote about the fields, about the sky, about how sorry he was for leaving before the harvest. And at the bottom, he added, "If I do not return, know that I stood where I was needed." He folded the letter carefully, but before he could send it, the order came. Advance. The world exploded into noise. Thomas ran across ground he once knew by heart. Cannonballs tore through wheat fields. The stone wall ahead seemed miles away. He felt heat in his chest, then cold. He fell. The sky above him looked exactly as it had when he was 10 years old. Wide, blue, endless. He reached into his coat pocket. The Bible, the letter. His fingers tightened around both. When Union forces finally pushed forward, they found him near the stone wall, face turned upward. The letter was still there, unopened. In 1933, during repairs to an old farmhouse outside Gettysburg, a carpenter found a leather Bible wedged between beams in the attic. Inside it was a folded letter. The ink had faded, but the words remained. The carpenter tracked down the last surviving Whitaker relative, a granddaughter living in Ohio. She opened the letter on the 70th anniversary of the battle, and for the first time in 7 decades, Thomas Whitaker's voice was heard. Not as a soldier, but as a son. By June of 1863, Thomas Whitaker no longer looked 19. War ages a man differently than time does. The smooth farm boy face had hardened. His shoulders were broader. His eyes, once filled with sky and fields, now carried things he did not speak of. The Union Army had begun moving north, shadowing Confederate General Robert E. Lee's advance. Thomas and his regiment marched through Maryland, boots wearing thin, uniforms soaked in sweat and dust. Rumors traveled faster than the soldiers. Lee's heading into Pennsylvania. Washington could fall. They say he wants to end the war on northern soil. Thomas walked beside Caleb Turner, who still carried that crooked grin he'd had since boyhood. "Imagine," Caleb muttered, adjusting his rifle strap. "We might be marching back to your farm." Thomas didn't smile. He had been thinking the same thing. 3 nights before they reached Gettysburg, mail arrived. Thomas held the envelope carefully, recognizing his mother's handwriting instantly. He stepped away from the campfire before opening it. The letter spoke of ordinary things. The cow had birthed a calf. Eliza had grown taller. The wheat was nearly ready. But at the bottom of the page, Margaret Whitaker wrote, "If the war ever comes near our home, promise me you will remember that you are fighting so that no mother has to fear again." Thomas folded the letter slowly. War had already come near. He just didn't know how near.
Confederate troops were already filtering into the small Pennsylvania town. Shoes. That was the rumor. Southern soldiers were searching Gettysburg for supplies, especially boots. Thomas would later think about the strangeness of that, how history can turn not on ideology alone, but on something as simple as leather and soles. When Union cavalry first clashed with Confederate forces west of town on July 1, it began almost accidentally. But by midday, it was no accident anymore. It was war in full voice. Thomas's regiment arrived to chaos. Smoke curled above rooftops. Civilians ran through streets. Church bells rang in panic. He saw houses he recognized, a bakery he once visited as a child, the road that led toward his family's farm. But there was no time for memory. The Union lines formed along Cemetery Hill. Gunfire cracked like thunder splitting wood. Thomas loaded, fired, reloaded. He didn't know who he hit. He didn't want to know. At one point, he glimpsed Confederate soldiers advancing through a field he had once harvested with his father. The wheat bent under gunfire the same way it once bent under wind. Only now, it would not rise again. When darkness finally settled, the battlefield did not grow quiet. The wounded cried out, thousands of voices calling for water, for doctors, for mothers. Thomas moved among them with a borrowed canteen. He found a Confederate soldier no older than 16, clutching a photograph. The boy looked up at him. "You from here?" the Confederate whispered. Thomas hesitated. "Yes." The boy swallowed hard. "It's pretty." Thomas looked toward the distant silhouette of the hills. "It used to be." He gave the boy water. War had made enemies of them, but pain had made them human again. The second day was worse. Fighting erupted at Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Peach Orchard. Thomas's regiment was ordered to reinforce Cemetery Ridge. He ran past stone walls he once helped repair as a child. The irony was unbearable. He was defending fences he had built. Mid-afternoon, artillery exploded so close that the ground trembled like an earthquake. Caleb was thrown backward by the shockwave. Thomas thought he was dead, but Caleb coughed and laughed weakly. "Guess I'm too stubborn to die." Thomas pulled him upright. Neither of them knew that stubbornness would not save them tomorrow. On July 2nd, as the sun bled red across the Pennsylvania sky, Thomas sat alone. He took out his mother's Bible. He ran his fingers over the leather cover. In the distance, campfires flickered like fallen stars. He thought about the farm, about Eliza chasing chickens, about his father sharpening tools, about his mother standing at the kitchen window. He knew what was coming. Rumors were spreading through camp. A massive Confederate assault at dawn. Thousands would charge across open ground, and Thomas's regiment would be waiting. He felt fear, not the sharp panic of battle, but something heavier, the kind that presses into your chest when you realize tomorrow might be your last sunrise. He reached into his satchel and pulled out paper, and he began to write. Thomas wrote slowly. Every word mattered. He described the sky, the fields, the way the air smelled before rain. He apologized for leaving before harvest. He told his mother that he understood now what his father meant about harder choices. He ended the letter with, "If I do not return, do not remember me as a soldier. Remember me as your son who loved the fields." He folded it carefully and placed it inside his Bible. The morning was unnaturally quiet. Then, at 1 p.m., the artillery barrage began. Over 150 Confederate cannons roared. The sky turned black with smoke. The ground shook continuously for 2 hours. Men covered their ears. Some prayed. Some wept silently. Thomas felt each explosion in his bones. When the cannon fire stopped, there was a silence so deep it felt holy. Then came the sight. Nearly 12,000 Confederate soldiers emerging from the tree line, advancing across open ground, toward Cemetery Ridge, toward Thomas. Thomas stood behind the stone wall. He loaded. He fired. He loaded again. The air filled with screams, gunfire, and the whistle of bullets. Caleb fell. This time, he did not laugh. Thomas dropped to his knees beside him. Caleb's eyes searched his. "Tell my pa," he whispered. "I will," Thomas said, though his voice broke. A bullet struck Thomas moments later. Heat, then cold. He collapsed backward, sky above him, the same sky he had loved since childhood. When the battle ended, over 50,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. It remains the bloodiest battle in American history. President Abraham Lincoln would later stand on that ground and deliver the Gettysburg Address, redefining the meaning of sacrifice. But Thomas Whitaker's name was never spoken from that podium. History rarely remembers farm boys, yet without them, there would be no history at all.